Hello, I'm Dr. Parme Giuntini from Otis College of Art and Design. Today I'm going to be talking about modern sculpture in the 19th century and focusing on the ways that artists like Auguste Rodin and Edgar Degas challenged the entrenched styles and practices of the Academy. By comparison to 19th century modern painters, avant-garde sculptors interested in monuments or public art faced some very unique problems. Large-scale sculpture commissions generally involved huge amounts of money, often public funding, and that could mean a committee like a city council, which represented a wide variety of tastes, rather than an individual patron with discretionary authority. What one might purchase for private pleasure was often quite different from what one agreed to commission on behalf of a city. Deliberations over design, installation, medium, size, and delivery could and did take months, and that's before the requisite time, manpower, and expense necessary to sculpt in marble or cast in bronze. Let's look at a specific example to get a clear idea of how these issues played out for both sculpture and art, and see what the challenges were when rocking the status quo. Paul Dubois was one of the most famous French academic sculptors of the 19th century. His tour de force was the tomb of General Lamoricière in the Cathedral of Nantes. Monumental in size, it is varied in its use of marble and bronze, and, fittingly for a French military hero, there are allegorical figures representing military courage, charity, faith, and meditation. There's a lot to look at, but let's focus on just one figure on the far right, military courage, because this demonstrates everything that distinguished 19th century sculpture and was so problematic for emerging modern aesthetics. We're going to be looking at one of the reproductions, so you can see the details. This particular one was installed at Mount Vernon Place in Baltimore, Maryland in 1885. Military courage is represented as a well-muscled young man dressed as a historical rather than a contemporary soldier. Someone out of ancient Rome, judging from the tunic and sandals, the sword, and the eagle-topped helmet. That loosely tied animal skin draping his shoulders is a generalized reference to Hercules, who is often shown with a lion's skin. The pose is casual, a soldier with his weapon at rest. Contemplative rather than aggressive. All those connotations and more were readily legible to a 19th century audience and exquisitely rendered in bronze because of the sculpture's virtuosity. The work resonates with the values and standards of the time. Most existing European sculpture, and there was a lot of it, tended to be figural and allegorical, honoring specific individuals and events. Famous sculptural installations like Bernini's Fountain of the Four Rivers in Rome and the Fountain of Apollo at Versailles are just two examples of the sculptural achievements that set the standard. Sculptors expected to be judged on their virtuosity, craftsmanship, and dramatic ability, rather than on innovation in form, and they were trained with that in mind. Although military courage was originally one of the figures for the tomb, it met with such success that other repetitions were cast, such as the one that is in Baltimore. At the other end of the spectrum, the works of Auguste Rodin offer the best example of avant-garde changes in aesthetics, as well as some of the problems that sculptural commissions posed. We're going to look at the Burghers of Calais, which was begun in 1884 and installed in Calais in 1889. That's 5 years, but it was not until after World War I that the city agreed to display the sculpture in the way and at the site that Rodin had intended. Calais is located on the coast of France, right across from the English Channel. For some decades, there had been interest in commissioning a sculpture that would commemorate the heroic actions of 6 Calais citizens who had voluntarily surrendered themselves to the English during the 100 Years' War in order to save the population of their city. As requested, barefoot, Dressed in sackcloth and with ropes around their neck, the men presented themselves to King Edward III for execution, although he relented at the last moment and spared them. It was a dramatic story of 14th century personal and civic heroism and a point of pride for the city. Getting the commission was a coup for Rodin. He was very interested in public art since this was the way that sculptors had historically gained major reputations and achieved widespread visibility for their work. Although he was influenced by earlier works, especially that of Michelangelo, the Burghers of Calais represents a modern approach to the representation of heroism. The 6 figures form a loose circle, and they stand on a low plinth. Now, although the city commissioners were very pleased with the representation of the men, they were dead set against that low plinth. Historically, public sculptures are set on high platforms, especially in urban settings. It was standard practice in Europe and had been since antiquity. It meant that cities could pave the areas around the monuments and create a greater sense of power and importance for the work, also make it easier to be seen. Putting the figural group on a low plinth decreased the psychological and physical space between the subject and the audience, allowing the audience to more directly engage the sculpture. That was Rodin's intention, but until 1917, the statue was mounted on a higher platform and surrounded by a wrought iron gate. Although the citizens of Calais considered these men to be heroes, Rodin did not use conventional nobilizing techniques. Rather than showing them as idealized figures in classical poses, he sculpted them in various ages of adulthood, individualizing their features and giving them gestures and poses that communicated a variety of emotions, ranging from grief to anger to consolation. The surface is heavily worked, with broken planes that create shadows and reflective areas, but do not literally represent specific textures of flesh, cloth, hair, or rope, which would have been the academic practice. The hands and feet of the figures are overly large and somewhat out of proportion. This would become a hallmark of Rodin, his way of emphasizing a connection between the human figure and earth. Unlike the smooth and level plinths people were accustomed to seeing, this one dips and rises and in some areas merges into the men's robes. The group is designed to emphasize interaction and communication, as though they were talking about their decision and its consequences during that eventful march to meet the English king. Rodin even depicted one man hunched over, holding his head with both hands, a representation that simply but profoundly communicated both grief and resignation. Because of this particular configuration, there is no single vantage point from which to view the sculpture, no one place to stand and see the group interact as a discrete unit. The viewer literally has to walk around the figures to see how they relate to each other. This created a modern approach to viewing, one which forces the viewer to engage in a more active way, to do more than just look and admire. There is literally no front face to this sculpture. Today, we are quite accustomed to sculpture that is installed at eye level, that invites us to engage in a variety of ways that we can even touch. We are not surprised by exaggerated proportions, nor a focus on the medium itself. But in the 19th century, this was highly irregular, especially for a memorial sculpture. Perhaps the most extreme comparison of the avant-garde approach to sculpture occurs in Rodin's Gates of Hell. You're looking at two stages of them, the plaster casts that the artist worked on for 37 years, and one of the bronze repetitions cast after his death. These were intended to be the entrance doors for a decorative arts museum, but the museum was never built. Even after the commission fell through, Rodin worked on the plaster model for over 30 years, until his death, so clearly this was important to him. When commissioned, He was able to decide the sculptural theme, and for that he chose the Inferno, a famous work by the Renaissance poet Dante. In his design, Rodin deliberately challenged the most famous existing doors in Europe, the north doors of the Florentine Bapistry, designed by Lorenzo Ghiberti in the 15th century and dubbed the Gates of Paradise by Michelangelo for their beauty. Unlike Ghiberti, whose doors celebrated a salvation of Christianity and tell an uplifting story in measured frames, Rodin forced a comparison in subject, interpretation, and technique. His hell is not a theological place referenced in biblical texts, but a psychological space for the estranged modern man, a site of psychic distress as eternal punishment. He opted for a modern secular perception, an existentialist rather than a religious position. Unlike Ghiberti's design, there are no complementary scenes or clearly told episodes. All the figures emerge from the surface in varying degrees of relief and are shown twisted, contorted, and in emotional distress. The massive figures, shadowy background, curved and angular surfaces create a continuous sense of movement and unrest. It is an unsettling work with no final positive solution. God has been replaced by a thinker, probably a familiar figure to you since it has been cast since then separately, and salvation replaced by perpetual indecision. In myriad ways, Rodin's doors represented the concerns of an increasingly secular society, where change was becoming the norm, where conventions and traditions met headfirst with new technology and cultural unrest. Works like The Thinker and Walking Man are familiar to audiences today because bronze repetitions were made in the early 20th century and purchased by a variety of museums around the world. In them, Rodin left a legacy for modern sculptors and audiences to contemplate. He reframed the body as a modern sculptural subject, stripping away the allegorical and mythological references and insisting that in a modern world the body could stand on its own. He accomplished this in a variety of ways. He exaggerated the proportions, which drew attention to hands and feet, two body parts that Rodin insisted were the primary human connection to nature and the world. He increasingly produced heavily worked surfaces that were not buffed and polished, and challenged hundreds of years of academic insistence that a properly rendered figural sculpture had to accurately represent textures like armor and flesh, hair and fabric. These are important changes because they influence the ways that professional artists and critics, as well as audiences, judged aesthetics. It's important to remember, though, that sculptures we now consider iconic for modern art, works like Balzac, for example, often met with dismal success when they were first presented. I'm going to end with one last sculpture of a very different sort, the 14-year-old dancer by the Impressionist painter Edgar Degas. Most of his works were small-scale nudes in the poses that he used for his paintings, and many of them were nudes in various ballet positions. Undoubtedly, this is the most famous. You're seeing one of the 28 bronze repetitions, although the original, which was exhibited in 1881, was actually molded out of wax and dressed in a real ballet tunic, tutu, slippers, and sported a wig and a satin ribbon. Needless to say, neither audiences nor critics responded favorably to the sculpture. Most of the reports found it rather ugly. Let's shift away a bit from the issue of aesthetics and talk about sculpture and mediums. Historically, most European sculpture is either stone, like marble or granite or limestone, or bronze. Using stone is considered a subtractive method because you have to hammer and chisel and chip away at the block to create the finished work. Bronze is an additive method because the final work is cast, although the sculptor makes the original model out of clay. Quite often, professional craftsmen did the bronze casting, since that was a technical specialty that most sculptors did not know or need to know. Either way, the point was the same. Individual works were executed in a single medium, and that was expected to be either stone or bronze. Nothing was added to them after that. The 14-year-old dancer is a mixed media, both in the original wax sculpture that Degas showed in 1881 and in the bronze repetitions. Walk into any museum that owns one, and you'll see that the figure always has a satin ribbon tied into her hair and a tulle tutu. We think nothing of that today because we are accustomed to sculptures that include a variety of mediums, including very cheap mediums like sheet metal. Sculptures can even have holes in them, and some of them move like Alexander Caldwell's mobiles. This is the result of avant-garde changes that began in the 19th century. By the end of the 19th century, Rodin and Degas had both experimented with new approaches to sculpture that would be highly influential on 20th century artists and aesthetics. There would be a growing interest in abstraction as many sculptors shifted away from highly figural and representational works. Artists began using a variety of mediums, including materials that were very inexpensive, like sheet metal and wire and wood. These changes meant a shift in aesthetics, a different way of understanding the notion of beauty. Many of the subsequent changes and advances would be accomplished with much smaller pieces that were intended for a collecting audience already predisposed towards avant-garde ideas. Not surprisingly, monumental sculpture, especially memorial sculpture, was slowest to change. These were expensive commissions, often subject to committee approvals, and in some ways, the representational and traditional practices still suited many social and cultural needs. Nevertheless, it's important to remember that monuments like the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, which created such a brouhaha when it was commissioned, drew such criticism for its color and design and low placement, is now the most visited memorial in Washington, D.C. It owes a debt of gratitude to the avant-garde and to artists like Rodin, who pioneered new ways of thinking and working with sculpture, with history, and with human emotion. Thank you.